The other thing they've talked about they've disagreed upon, then we can touch on perhaps some things that they ought to talk about, is they've diverged, I think, quite a bit on Russia. This has been an area of clear divergence. Mrs. Clinton taking a much harder line against the Russians, a bit more hawkish about the Russians. Mr. Trump at times talking about his admiration for Vladimir Putin, has suggested at least one time or more that perhaps we should accept the acquisition of Crimea as part of Russia, which I will tell you sends tremors down the backs of many of my European friends in NATO. This is transferred further, I think, into their discussion of what we might do about ISIS, because one has to acknowledge the Russians now are heavily involved in this, and the solution to the problem of Syria, if there is a solution, is going to require some involvement by the Russians. But still in all, it's unclear if that's possible, and we can talk about Syria in a second. But as we try to figure out what the Russians want and what we ought to do about it, one candidate seems to be for more of a rapprochement, one seems to be more for a very stern approach to the Russians. To my mind, the Russians have made a decision strategically that they could confront the United States, particularly in places like Ukraine and Crimea. And over time, we would kind of sort of give up on the economic sanctions and particularly perhaps drive a wedge with the Europeans. Many European governments perhaps think they ought to give in on that. That has not worked out too well for them. And even today or yesterday, an inquiry basically confirmed that the Malaysian airliner was in fact shot down by a Russian ground-air missile. Still unclear if that was launched, frankly, by dissident groups in eastern Ukraine, but frankly, actually launched by Russian troops working with them. We do know the launcher, there's photographs of that disappearing into Russia, crossing the border shortly thereafter. So that has not furthered their case. Many people would argue one needs to acknowledge the strength of Russia. I think that's what Mr. Trump would say. Because of their success with the air campaign, for example, in Syria. Any point to that? That being said, we're on about, believe it or not, this is almost the first anniversary exactly of the commencement of the Russian air campaign in Syria. They've conducted thousands of air strikes right now, very intensive air strikes in and around Aleppo. Some suggestion perhaps 1,000 civilians killed over the last week or so. But whether you buy into that or think that's to be criticized morally, if you just look at it cold-bloodedly in military operational terms, the map of Syria today does not look a heck of a lot different than the map of Syria a year ago. The Russians have, through their support of the Syrian government, forestalled Mr. Assad's collapse, but they haven't really expanded the footprint under the Assad government's control. And I would argue probably unlikely to do that simply because the Assad government, by this point, doesn't have sufficient ground troops to secure that. So absent a Russian incursion of ground forces, that is unlikely to occur. We're in a stalemate, and how long this conflict could go on, I think, is anybody's guess based on the involvement of major powers, not only the United States and the Russians, but also the Iranians, Hezbollah coming out of Lebanon, the Turks, and a number of other countries. So the things they've talked about, and I think diverged upon, would be that, how one treats the alliances, how one thinks about, how we fight the war in ISIS, as well as how we deal with the Russians. I will say one other thing that came up in the debate I wanted to stress. Though Mr. Trump has got a secret plan totally to win the war in ISIS, the one thing he's talked about that I found really curious was that ISIS never would have occurred if we'd taken the oil. And he said that, and he continues to repeat that, and that really kind of puzzles me, because first of all, that's illegal under international law, first of all. Second of all, God only knows how many ground troops, American ground troops, it would take to secure not only the places where the oil is pumped out of, but the pipelines. We had a heck of a time during our presence there with 150,000 troops to assist the Iraqis in trying to secure the pipelines to export oil, because we wanted to do that because one of the goals was to get the Iraqi economy back on its feet. And enormous effort and cost, manpower, et cetera, went into that with only limited success, to say the least. So God knows how many ground troops it would take to accomplish those two tasks. And that further, I think, assumes that 26 million Iraqis are going to stand idly by while we loot the country of the one resource they've got and not do too much about it. So there has been diversion on how we conduct the war in Iraq and Syria and how we did before, the alliances and our dealing with the Russians.